Hello, guys. Welcome back to a new Team Talks episode, and this one is special because we're doing it's the first interview with two people. We're doing with Aparajita Lomor. She is our marketing director, and
I
we're together. We're gonna interview Mr. Oakland. He is a U.S. Army veteran.
Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
So we're gonna start with the first question about your career and military service. Can you tell us about your experience in the U.S. Army and the key leadership roles you held?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I spent 23 years on active duty in the Army. Started off as an infantry officer, second lieutenant, and I had a platoon, had several platoons of 30 to 35 men that I led. And then including Desert Shield, Desert Storm, 1990, 91. That was my first operational deployment. And then became a captain in the Army, and I switched over to armor cav. So I drove around on M1 tanks and did things associated with that. Had two company commands where I was in charge of my largest company command. I was in charge of 375 people, and I was signed for $252 million worth of equipment, and I had a $10 million budget at the age of 30, 32, 33.
That's impressive.
Yeah, I mean, you don't get those kinds of experiences as a young man or a young woman in most professions. And then did a couple disaster relief operations here in the United States. I did Hurricane Hugo in Charleston, and I was deployed down here to southern Florida for Hurricane Andrew. And then made major, my two things as a senior captain, early major, was I did a deployment, did operations in Bosnia and in Kosovo as a peacekeeper. And then I ran an Army ROTC program where I helped produce the next generation of leaders for not only the Army, but for the nation. And in my time associated with the Army, which has been about 40 years of my life, I've had my hand one way or another in commissioning over 600 lieutenants, officers for the Army.
So I have a question. So even though you're retired, you also have like a key role in the Army, correct?
So right now, I do nothing with the Army right now. I retired 1 October of last year from my Department of the Army job where I was recruiting for Army ROTC. Now I'm just a keynote speaker. I wrote my first book, I'm writing my second book, and I'm out talking about leadership. And I look at it as my responsibility as a leader today, who's had some experience over 40 years of leadership, to pass on those experiences and knowledge that I've gained over those 40 years to that next generation of leaders, which, by the way, are you guys.
Yeah, I agree with that.
My philosophy is, look, we are going to reap what we sow. If my generation doesn't do a good job of teaching you guys how to be good leaders, then we deserve everything we get.
Very true. So about so another question is, like 40 years in the Army is a lot of a lot of experience. So can you tell us which one were like your toughest challenges you had in the Army?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the toughest assignment I had was probably Kosovo, as a peacekeeper. Trying to, one of my jobs, I was a major. I was the operations officer, so I planned the day-to-day operations of our armored battalion that was there. And we had some Greek soldiers with us. We had some Swedish and Finnish soldiers that we worked with, and we bordered the Russian sector. So had a lot of international stuff, not to mention, had to deal and keep the peace between the Serbs, the Albanians, and the Gypsies, three very different groups of people there. And I remember, I spent a lot of my days was in meetings with people trying to figure out how to make things better for them and to bring their broken society back together. And I remember when I started, I only had in the room, I would only have Serbs, or I'd only have Albanians, or I'd only have Gypsies. But then, in a month or two into it, I figured out if I really want to fix this, I got to get them all in the same room together. And that was a challenge, getting all of them in the room together and keeping the meeting very civil and peaceful. Because each one of them wanted to tell me about the last 1,000 years, what the other side did to them. And I said, look, I'm a history major. I know all the bad things that have happened around here, but we have to move from this point forward or we're not going to make anything better. And by the time I left, we had reopened a mine that had had all three Albanian, Serb, and Gypsy workers. We had opened a meat packing plant that had all three of the group working there. So we had started to make some progress by the time I left there 9 months later. So it was challenging, but it was very rewarding. It really was.
Wow,
those are some great skills right there. Like, it requires so much critical thinking, being, calm at every moment. So props to you.
Well, one of the things that I learned being a combat arms officer in the Army is, first of all, you got to understand the culture you're in, and you got to make sure people understand the culture they're in. Then you got to trust people, because leadership is about people and trust, period. There's got a bunch of other, but if you understand it's about people and trust, then you can lead any organization. I don't care what it is. And I kind of proved that. I led a food bank after I retired from the Army for 2 years. And, I didn't know anything about a food bank except that it had food in it. That's about all I knew. And so if you understand it's about people and trust, you can do that. But one of the things that I learned during crisis times, during hurricane operations, during combat operations, peacekeeping operations, is that as the leader, you have to kind of step back at certain times, let the people that you've trained and they can do what you're asking them to do, let them do their job. And you got to step back and take a look at the bigger picture and figure out, okay, what else could go wrong, or what else do I need to be thinking about to help my people do the job I'm asking them to do. And so that's one of the skills that you learn as you go along. And it's not one that you get right away, but as you go along, you build that skill. And I think I got to the point where I was pretty good at that. And I would just step back and say, okay, I know they can handle what I'm asking them to do. I trained them, so I know they can do it. What else can I do as the leader to make their job easier, to make sure that they're going to be successful? And so that's the kind of the role I ended up taking.
I see. So, Mr. Oakland, I have some questions to ask you.
Sure.
So, what does servant leadership mean to you, and how has it influenced your leadership style?
Yeah, I was lucky as a young man in high school. I had two people who were a huge influence on me as a high school student. I had my basketball coach, Coach Terry Niedzwiecki, who I still stay in contact with 40 something years later, almost 50 years later. And he was a servant leader. He understood it was not about him, and it wasn't about putting together a great basketball team. It was about helping to produce good young men who were going to be good husbands and good fathers and good citizens. And so he did that, and he was very good at it. And in my high school history teacher, who I kept in touch with all these years, right up until about 6 months ago when he passed away, he was the same way. He was always there, available for you even if it wasn't anything about history. And he is the reason I majored in history in college. There's no doubt about that. I loved the classes he gave, but he was there for you if you had a problem in another class, or if you had just a personal problem. He was always willing to sit down and talk to you and kind of walk you through the options. Because in my opinion, servant leadership is, I told every single young lieutenant that I helped commission, look, servant leadership is very simple. It's not about you, and it's all about you. It's not about you and the title you're going to get or the privileges you're going to get, or that you're going to get better pay and live in a nicer house and drive a nicer car. Leaders get those things, good. But if that's the only reason you want to be a leader, please go do something else. You're not going to be a good one. It's all about you and how you train, empower, and treat the people that you have the privilege, and it is a privilege, to lead. And the organization that you get the privilege to lead. That's what servant leadership is about. It's about helping other people be better. And when I give that message, especially to young men and women, one of the things I always hear, somebody will come up to me after my talk and they'll say, Colonel McCulloch, I heard you, but I want my next promotion. I want my next pay raise. And I always tell them, look, if you do this right, if you are a servant leader, you will get your pay raise, because you'll make people better, and they will make the organization better, and you will get the credit in the end as the leader, and you're going to get your pay raise. But you got it for the right reason, not because you were greedy or selfish, but because you helped other people become better people, not just better workers, but better people.
That is so right. And I agree with every word you've said. Like, it's so true on every level. So another question I had was, would you want to share a story where a positive example made a big difference for your team, especially?
Oh, that's a good one. Let me think just for a second on that one.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I've had lots of those experiences where.
What's the most memorable one? Like, you could tell us your favorite.
Yeah, so I think one of them absolutely was, you know, I think Christmas Day in Costa. It was very, very cold. It was snowing that day, you know, and I had platoons, you know, groups of men out all over our sector. I mean, they were stationed in towns and doing their jobs. And I, you know, I got up early that morning, and I did call my wife and kids. And then I went out and I spent all day going around checking with every single platoon and talking to every single guy out there. And making sure that they understood that I appreciated what they were doing. You know, on Christmas Day, you're out here doing your job, and you don't get to call home and talk to your wife and kids or whoever it is that you want to talk to at home. And I appreciate that you're out here doing that. And I talked to every single one of our soldiers who were outside the gate doing their job that day. And you could just see how much they appreciated that. Just that little gesture. But I spent all day. I left like at 6:30 in the morning, and I don't think I got back till like 7:30, 8 o'clock that night. And I just went around place to place to place talking to people.
That's a really selfless thing to do. And I think they must have appreciated your efforts. And it's a big deal that you know, took that big step ahead by thinking about others as well.
Yeah,
So
it
leadership
really
right
did make a difference. I mean, you could tell it in their face that it made a difference, that somebody cared enough to come out and check on them and see if they needed anything, and just to tell them Merry Christmas, you know.
Yeah. No, it's very important, especially, you know, they're doing so much for the country. I had a question about your transition to like civilian roles. So how did your military experience help you in your roles in academics and community service?
Right. So I again, I think that, you know, the skills you learn, I don't care what profession you learn them in, will transfer to whatever new profession you want to do. Again, I was a combat arms officer, and then I ran a food bank. I didn't know anything about a food bank, but I understood that it was about the people and that they had to trust me. And, you know, the example I use, you know, that's the example I use, is that I went in there and I started asking questions. I didn't go in there like I knew everything, and I was the, you know, the be all know all. I wanted to learn from the people who who did the job. I got out from behind my desk and I walked around and I went to different people. And I said, why do you do it that way? Is there some way that we can do it better? Is there something I can provide for you to make it go better? And I started building that rapport and that trust with people. And that's one of the pieces of advice that I gave every single young leader that I ever talked to is every day, go out, get out from behind your desk, go out and find one person in your organization, at least one, and find out something new about them, not about their job, about their personal life. What's their spouse's name? What's their kids' names? What sports do their kids play? What's your hobby? What do you like? What don't you like? Get to know them, because nobody's going to trust somebody they don't know. I'm sorry, that's not human nature. You trust the people you get to know. One of the problems that I see is that leaders want to go out and find out about their people, but they don't want their people to find out about them. Sorry, it's a two-way street. You got to be willing to answer those same questions for them if you really want to get to know them and build that trust. And once you do that, I'm telling you, you'll see a huge difference in the trust level. And without trust, you can't lead. That's what allows the leader-led relationship to happen. But I think all those skills, my negotiation skills, my leadership skills, my just being tough, knowing I can get through whatever situation is thrown at me, those all transfer to the new profession. A month after I took over running the food bank, the day-to-day operation of the food bank, the BP oil spill happened in the Gulf.
Oh.
And so, and the food bank that I ran the day-to-day operations covered 52 counties along the Gulf Coast of the United States. So I had all the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, all the Gulf Coast of Alabama, and about a third of the Panhandle in Florida. And a lot of those people made their living in the Gulf.
Yeah.
Shrimping, canning, fishing, whatever, and they couldn't go out there anymore. So we had to feed them during that whole time that the Gulf was shut down. When I took over, we were handing out 1.2 million pounds of food a year. 2 years ago, when I handed it off to the next person, we were handing out 3.8 million pounds. We doubled the size of the truck fleet, and we almost doubled the size of the staff, because I knew that we had to do something different, and I knew that we could handle, having been in combat and peacekeeping operations and disaster relief operations in the Army. I knew that we could come up with ways to handle whatever was being thrown at us.
That's a really big initiative, and I applaud you for that, honestly.
Yeah, well, I always tell people, when I tell them we went from 1.2 million to 3.8 million pounds a year, would I have done that if it hadn't been for that Gulf Coast, if it hadn't been for the BP oil spill? I don't know. Would the emphasis have been there to grow and do those kinds of things? I don't know. But
it serves as like a motivation.
When you are faced with an issue, you got to decide, you got to figure out how to solve that issue. And
that's right.
And that's what we did.
So you talk about the food bank as something very special that you had, but why did you join the food bank after?
Right. Yeah. So when I got ready to retire from the Army, I was in Mobile, Alabama. I was running that Army ROTC program at the University of South Alabama, and my wife and I loved it in Mobile, and I really didn't want to leave Mobile at that point. And I had a couple of job offers in companies, private companies and public companies and things like that. And I just had no interest in jumping into corporate America. I wanted to continue with my servant leadership, and I could have done that in the corporate world, but the food bank offered, kind of like the Army, service to maybe not people, the country at that point, but to community. And that really resonated with me. And so that's why I chose to choose that over some corporate job.
That's nice. So we're gonna talk. So my next question is about the recruitments. So how did you spot and develop leadership skills in young cadets?
Yeah, so it's over time. I mean, I get asked all the time, are leaders born or are they made? And I said, there is a combination. I mean, there are some people that are just born with some leadership traits and skills and abilities I believe that. And if you don't believe that, go out onto a playground with a bunch of 5-year-olds. Somebody is leading out there.
That's
There's
true.
somebody that everybody's following. And nobody
Mm-hmm.
taught that 5-year-old how to be a leader. That just came natural to them, and they became the leader of that group. So there is some of that, but the majority of leaders are made. And I believe that you can learn, if you want to, you can learn how to be a good leader. And it just comes from learning some knowledge of what it takes to be a leader, and then putting it into practice. What you have to do the things you have to do to be a good leader are not hard. Doing them, actually putting it to use, is the hard part, day in and day out. And that takes a little self-discipline. It takes some motivation. It takes some dedication to do that. But if you want to do that, you can. And so, like, ROTC is a 4-year program. So, I mean, we got 4 years to develop those things in those young men and women before they go out there and be an officer in the Army. And by the time they're ready to go out there and do that, they're ready to be a leader.
Okay. So you're talking about your book, right? That you wrote, and you're already writing a second one. That's good to hear. So what inspired you to write your leadership legacy, and what do you hope readers learn from it?
Yeah, so it's funny, when I wrote that book, the idea in my head was I was writing it for young, aspiring leaders who just took over as a leader, and I think I did that. If you read the reviews on Amazon, I think I hit that mark. But I also, kind of surprised to me, some senior leaders. I had a 2-star Marine Corps general who read it, didn't know the guy, and he reached out to me on LinkedIn after he read it, and he said, Oak, I didn't learn a whole lot of new things. I learned some new techniques from your book. But he said, what I really took out of it is I was reading along, and I'd say to myself, I used to do that really well, but I don't do that so well anymore. Maybe I need to dedicate time to go back and doing, and remember what it was that made you a good leader. Because we all need that little nudge every once in a while. We get lazy, or we forget some of the things that we used to do. But the reason I really wrote it was because I really do feel that it is my responsibility, as leaders today, our responsibility to pass on the lessons and knowledge that we have learned over our time as a leader to the next generation. Those of you who are going to take over and are the future of this world, we have to pass that on, because we are going to reap what we sow. If we don't do a good job, we deserve everything we get.
So on top of that question, I would want to ask you that what inspired you to write your book, Your Leadership Legacy, and what do you hope readers learn from that?
Yeah. So I think that, there is no talk of theory in my book whatsoever. No leadership theory. It's all everyday things that everyday leaders
Your
do.
personal experiences, right?
Yes. And I talk about some principles that leaders have to use, servant leadership, communication, problem solving, decision making, professional development, those type of things. And then I use a personal story to kind of emphasize the importance of that and how it helped me develop into the leader that I am.
I see. So on top of that, how do you, balance your work on LinkedIn and your retired life, like your personal life, given your busy career?
Yeah, I get that all the time, and I've always gotten that throughout my career.
It's a big question.
Right? Yes, because we all have to do that. I mean, I don't care who you are. And there's times, depending on your profession, that you don't have a choice. When I was deployed, I didn't have a choice about trying to balance family life, and I wasn't around my family. What I tell people is, look, when you are, and even in the corporate world, there's times when things get so busy that you got to kind of put those other things aside and concentrate on your job. And that's okay. That's okay. You have to do that to be successful. But then when you do have time to be with your family and the other things that are important to you, then that's when you got to dedicate the time to do that. And people I got asked just, I don't know, about 2 or 3 weeks ago on a podcast, somebody asked me, how do you re- recharge your battery? And I tell people, look, for me, it's the 3 F's. And everybody's got to pick their own thing. For me, it's the 3 F's. It's faith, family, and fishing. You know, when I get to the point where I feel stress, and stress is a good thing. You know, stress is what drives us to be successful and drives us to do good things, but it can get to the point where it's harmful. When I start getting stressed more than I would like, I fall back on those 3 things. I go to church, I spend time with my wife and my kids and my grandkids, and I do some fishing. And that kind of recharges my battery, and then I can start new again and get back at it.
Yeah, in fact, fishing is a really great hobby. My sister also does that sometimes.
Yeah, I love to do it. If somebody told me I couldn't go out and talk anymore and I couldn't do these things anymore, I'd spend all my day out fishing.
Oh,
Yeah, your fishing is like my soccer. So
Yeah.
soccer-
Everybody's got to have their own thing.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah,
if you do have to have something, I tell people all the time, you got to have something that allows you to have some personal time. And for me, you know, I used to run a lot. I don't run anymore, but I used to run.
did you used to
3,
do
4
marathon?
No, I never did a marathon, but I used to run 3, 4, 5
Oh.
miles a day. And and I actually miss it. And what I miss about it isn't necessarily the running piece of it. What I miss about it, and I kind of have substituted the fishing for that, is that that's my time alone. That's my
Right.
time to either work on a problem in my mind or not think about anything. Whatever I wanted at that point, whatever helped me, that's what I would do. And but it was my personal time. And everybody needs to have some time set aside, some personal time to deal with those kinds of things.
Right.
So to finish off, I have this last question. So, with your life in the army, with your life after the army in the food bank, what you say is your greatest achievement in your career?
Absolutely. You know, I titled my book "Your Leadership Legacy" for a reason, because I believe it is so important, and that is what I'm most proud of, is the 600 plus lieutenants and the other people that I've touched over the years to help be better leaders. And you know, somebody asked me on a podcast, they said, so what does legacy mean to you? And that's a great question. And to me, legacy has 2 parts. Your legacy as a leader has 2 parts. A very small part of that is what you actually accomplish. Now, that is important because results do matter. You know, you got to be successful at whatever it is you choose to do. But if you tie your legacy to what you did in an organization or a company or whatever, when you leave, and we are all going to leave, I promise you, one way or the other. When you leave and the next person comes in and takes over and they change things, then where's your legacy?
Yeah.
Your legacy is that next generation of leaders that you help produce, that are going to carry on the things that you taught them as a servant leader for the next 15, 20, 30 years. And then they're going to pass it on to the next generation, who's then going to pass it on to the next generation down through the way. I had a guy who worked for me one time, and I say he worked for me, he was probably a better leader than I was. And one day we were talking about the significance of what we were doing, producing the next generation of leaders for the Army and the nation. And he said to me, you know, sir, great leadership handed down from generation to generation is what develops great nations. And I thought, wow, what a powerful quote. And it's absolutely true. But the most powerful part of that quote is that you can substitute that word nations for anything you want. Family, business, army, food bank, hospital, university, doesn't matter. Because every organization at every level needs a good leader. And that is your legacy, passing on that good leadership to the next generation.
That is really wise, Mr. Oakland.
Wow, that was very powerful. I just want to say thank you so much for your time. Um, the interview was wonderful, and I hope people will learn a lot from it. Do you have any final words?
Yeah, the last thing when people give me an opportunity, the last thing I always say to people is this. As a leader, as a person, but certainly as a leader, you are going to make a difference in somebody's life every day. Every single day, you will make a difference in at least one person's life every day. Why not make a conscious decision to make a positive difference in somebody's life every day? Imagine how much better our families, our neighborhood, our community, our town, our city, our state, our country, the world would be if everybody made a conscious decision to make one positive difference in one person's life every single day.
Yeah, that would definitely make an impact, like a really good positive impact.
Yes,
Always try to be kind, right?
absolutely.
So as I said, thank you so much for your time. I
Thank
appreciate
you
it
so much.
And
Yeah,
We're
thanks
really
for having me.
grateful to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
so bye-bye, guys. See you next time.